roots of American councils are very specific to the times that a group of its founders grew up. I sometimes think of them as sort of the technocratic 1950s. But this is a time, if you remember, when a generation of Americans grew up with a fascination with the technologies that made it possible for the Soviet Union to launch the Sputnik in 1957, in October 57. There was this fascination with a looming competition was no longer just about military primacy, but a competition with another superpower in the area of technology, in the science, of engineering, of industrialization, of culture as well. And if you were in that area generally, you needed to go on, whatever field you want to do, chemistry, physics, aerospace, you needed 3 languages. One was English, one was German in those days, and the third was Russian. And I think that sort of had drawn us in both kind of from a point of fascination of technology, but also fascination of the language. What made the founding of our organization possible when it did happen was something we had nothing to do with and didn't even know a lot about at the time, but a visit by Henry Kissinger and President Richard Nixon to Moscow in the late spring of 1972, about 1 year after the great opening of China. These are essentially places off limits. And then Prime Minister Alexei Kosygin signed a major cooperative agreement with the United States in technology cooperation, which, among other things, led to the creation of the first joint Soviet-American space program known as Apollo-Soyuz. But in that same agreement, there was another piece that was maybe getting less attention, and that is it allowed the two countries to cooperate in the area of teaching and study of one another's languages. I happened to be in Moscow that summer on an exchange, a teacher's exchange, the only one of its kind, and had arrived in Moscow in June with a list of names of faculty members, scholars, and phone numbers. And one of those was the name of Vitaly Kostomarov, had been given to me by Erwin Weil, one of the co-founders. And I did meet up with Vitaly early on. And by the end of that summer, we had sketched out, wanting to respond to this new collaborative agreement that the two countries had just reached, a plan that would have allowed, very modest plan, that would have allowed for the creation of the first generation of Soviet American textbooks, in which the authors would be representatives of both cultures, that would have called for a conference of scholars eager to share research in the overall area of linguistics and Russian. And thirdly, more ambitiously, would have opened up the doors for an exchange of actually sending Americans to Russia to study and bringing Russians here to do American English. So I see the Sputnik, and then I see the 1972 protocol as being kind of defining moments, both in my own education, but also in the evolution of the organization, because that launched us with the first Soviet American conference in 1974, with participation of a distinguished group of Russian scholars, and with a strong participation of our colleagues here in this country at MIT, as well as at Amherst College. And that also brought together a group of colleges and universities and representatives that essentially became the chartering group, the consortium, which became American Council of Teachers of Russian, and then later American Councils for National Education. The textbook project took another 5 years to finish, and it completed in 1980, a year by which all the good feelings of détente and Apollo-Soyuz had vanished. The Soviets had already invaded Afghanistan. The Americans had decided to boycott the 1980 Olympics, and they decided to arrest the distinguished scholar Sakharov and send him off to exile. So essentially everything had gone wrong by 1980, and miraculously our collaborative textbook came out anyway. Just as the sort of founding of American councils was closely related to a kind of set of geopolitical circumstances that made it possible at one point to begin. These all are kind of significant international events, such as this meeting, the 1988 summit of Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev here in Washington. What came out of those annual summit meetings, actually biannual summit meetings of the two presidents, was a decision partly inspired by Ronald Reagan's vision that he wanted to see 1 million Russian kids watching Sesame Street. And he wanted to see Americans appreciating and understanding the depths and excellence of Russian culture and Russian education. With the strong political support of Senator Bill Bradley on the Hill and of President Reagan himself, we were invited to help design and implement the first large-scale exchange of Soviet and American youth in 1989 that would essentially realize this Reagan-esque dream of 1,000 Americans and 1,000 Russian kids staying in one another's homes and visiting one another's schools and getting to know each other as regular people and not as enemies. Then the next event that I would mention was the creation of the Open World program in 1999, and that gave us a program called Open World, which goes on to this day. And the awful tragedy of 9/11, among many other things, showed that our country was ill-prepared to deal with significant populations and regions of the world that we understood poorly, whose languages we did not know, and whose ideals and goals were at best murky to us. And this was another, if you will, diplomatic exigency that American Councils was able to respond to based on its expertise in knowing what it means to study and master critical world language, a language and a culture that is vastly different than our own. We engage and train Americans in the critical languages, the parts of the world that really have strategic importance for U.S. international relations and represent areas that Americans tend to not know well. So that brought us then the advent of a series of outbound programs for Americans that included NISLY-Y, the CLS program, the flagship programs, and the expansion of our RLAS programs, TCLP. How was that possible? It was possible because we had those models worked out from the 1970s in Moscow. We knew the challenges of working in a critical area. We knew the challenges of getting people to the right level to be immersed in those languages so they could actually have the competence and the professional know-how to later go on and work in those areas.